Introduce bills and Vice Chairman Lindstrom.
Do I have to do this all three at the same time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Where's my list of bills?
We will now open the hearing on LB 430, 432, and 433, all introduced by the Revenue Committee.
Thank you, Vice Chairman Lindstrom and the Revenue Committee. My name is Lou Ann Linehan, L-O-U, capital A-N-N, capital L-I-N-E-H-A-N. The three bills we're going to discuss today, LB 430, 432, and 433, are commonly known as shell bills, meaning there are bills to create the Revenue Committee. So I think even the new, well, we have a lot of experience on this committee. We have two members who have been here before, who are back. We have almost everybody else has at least 4 years experience. We have Senator Bostar, who doesn't have that much experience here, but he's got a lot of experience that can be very helpful to this committee. We struggle in Nebraska we need to simplify and improve our tax code. We have a property tax problem that we have addressed with income and sales taxes to the tune, well, if you include the homestead exemption, it's around $750 million. And they're not transparent, they're not easily understood, and it's just not good tax policy. I mean, it's upside down from good tax policy. We have an income tax rate, both corporate and individual, that make us uncompetitive. So we have to, since 1989, we have had to pass incentive packages. They're not popular, not transparent, but we all know, or at least 44 senators agreed last year, that when we passed the Imagine Act in LB 1107, we have to do this because we will lose employers, we will lose jobs, and our economy will go into a tailspin. But again, it's not transparent. We've heard at least two bills in front of the committee this week, or in the last month or so, about how we don't like incentives because they're not transparent. We don't know who gets them. We don't know if it really pays for itself. So I would be of the mindset that we need to start all over, and this committee needs to build a package along with, the whole time we're doing it, work with other members of the legislature so we're not surprised anything. It's not secret. It'll be very wide open and transparent. That makes it simple, makes it competitive, and we can explain it to our neighbors. Because I don't know if any of you have had the pleasure of explaining 1107 to any of your constituents, especially the income tax, property tax credit. Just the name should give you a hint. This is not going well. But I had the pleasure of my younger brother calling me on a Saturday, asking me to explain it to him. And he listened patiently, and he's like, nobody's gonna like that, that's just stupid. So there we go, that's what we have. So I think we can do better. So with that, I would take questions.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you. We will now have our first proponent.
Thank you. I want to apologize. You've got two separate testimonies because I thought we were doing them all separate. So I'm going to try to squish them together in the time. My name is Sarah Curry, S-A-R-A-H-C-U-R-R-Y, and I'm the Policy Director for the Platt Institute. So as Senator Linehan said, Nebraska needs tax reform. We support the idea of tax reform, especially a revenue neutral tax reform. And so we have a couple of ideas, and I'm happy to elaborate on any of these with questions, because I'm going to try to respect the time. On the corporate income tax, as I stated last week, I think it was, moving to a single rate will make us more competitive. 30 states already do this. We have a graduated rate. From a public policy standpoint, it doesn't make sense to have a graduated corporate income tax rate because it doesn't meet the same requirements as the ability to pay like the personal income tax. So we would like to replace our current system with a flat rate tax of 5% that would allow us to be competitive among the region, and it would simplify the tax code, and it would also help those corporations and possibly save some money on the incentive side because we wouldn't have to pay so much there because they'd have a lower tax rate. For personal income tax, actually our income tax personal adheres to many of the principles of sound taxation, a relatively broad base, but when you have a broad base, you should have low rates, and Nebraska does not have low rates having this broad base. And so we would like to see this 4-rate progressive income tax structure replaced with, again, a flat rate tax of 5%. This is the exact same thing that North Carolina did when they did their historic tax reform in 2013. They went to a flat rate 5%. Now, a lot of people are going to say that that's very regressive, and you can solve that, which is what North Carolina did, by enacting a zero income tax bracket, which essentially means the first $15,000 or $12,000 or whatever you decide can be zero taxed, and then that 5% flat rate would go into effect after that. So it works like a flat rate, but it sort of has two rates if you look at that. The other thing that we encourage is looking at LB430, and that's the increasing the earned income tax credit. If you again want to address that, if you want to add a measure of progressivity to the tax code for the flat rate 5%, if you pair it with an expansion of the EITC along with that zero per tax rate, it can help lower the tax, make our state more competitive without negatively impacting taxpayers who may only pay into those lowest brackets. So that's the way to do it. I also highlighted LB430, Senator Linehan's bill, because we understand that what we would like to see is very aggressive and might not be politically possible. So at least bringing that corporate income tax rate down to parity would help us be more competitive and also help simplify our tax code. On the sales tax side, we all know we need to broaden the sales tax base. Everyone has said that. It's been identified in many of the past tax studies that this body has done. And so we believe that all personal consumption, actually including groceries, should be included in the sales tax base. Prepared foods are already taxed. Many opponents to that say it's regressive, but research has shown that it's quite the opposite because federal law already exempts grocery purchases with SNAP and WIC benefits. And so higher income individuals spend more on grocery purchases, and so they're proportionally benefiting from the current exemption. And then also, as a part of the sales tax base expansion, it should never fall on business purchases. We all know that taxing business inputs are non-transparent, and the tax is often passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices, and tax pyramiding is also detrimental to our economy, so we don't want to do that. We really like the approach that Senator Breezy took in his LB422. We think that is an appropriate reform. Ideally, Nebraska's sales tax base should include all personal consumption and excluding business purchases. And so we know that this committee will likely decide to draw the line somewhere short of that. So correcting the current imbalance between goods and services and the sales tax is an excellent starting point. We would like to see the sales tax rate reduced from 5.5% to 5%. While still having the additional revenue from that, we could lower personal income taxes and corporate income taxes and possibly also have enough to reduce property taxes. According to LB422's fiscal note, a 1.5% local option sales tax with that base broadening provision would generate around $250 million by FY 24-25. And so we feel like that should be enough to eliminate the economically harmful inheritance and tangible personal property tax. And we would also like to see that addressed in a tax reform package as well. I'm going to stop there and see if anyone has any questions, because that was a lot, and I'm sorry I threw it all at you like that.
It's okay. Any questions from the committee? Seeing none?
Thank you.
Other proponents? Any Oh, you're a proponent or you coming in neutral? Okay. Any opponents? Seeing none, we'll now have neutral testifiers on LB 430, 432, and 433. Welcome.
Thank you. Chair Linehan and members of the Revenue Committee, my name is Catherine Lawhead. That's KATHERINE I'm a senior policy analyst with the Tax Foundation. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan tax policy research organization based in Washington, D.C., and we don't take a position on legislation, but I appreciate the chance to share some informational points with you today. First, I'd like to commend this committee for carving out the time to discuss tax modernization. These bills are an important conversation starter to discuss structural improvements that would make the tax code less burdensome to current Nebraska residents while making the state more attractive to prospective businesses and new residents alike. Tax modernization is important because the underlying tax code right now hasn't changed much since 1967, when the individual and corporate income taxes and sales tax were all first adopted. The state's economy has, of course, evolved quite a bit since then, but most of the laws that govern and that impact economic activity in Nebraska were written with the 20th century economy in mind. Our state business tax climate index, which ranks states according to the competitiveness of their tax structure, ranks Nebraska at slightly below average, 28th out of the 50 states. So with that in mind, last month we released a report that identifies the areas of Nebraska's tax code that are most in need of improvement. The report offers suggestions on how each of the major taxes could be improved to promote economic growth while making the tax code more simple, stable, neutral, and transparent. I don't have time to discuss all those findings now, but I'll give you a quick overview. Nebraska does indeed have high property taxes, which is, of course, a widespread concern that policymakers will likely want to address as part of any broader comprehensive tax modernization plan. In recent years, in response to taxpayers' concerns, the state has dedicated increasing amounts of revenue from the state to offset local property taxes paid. But unless and until local spending patterns change, property taxes will remain on an upward trajectory due to rising valuations. Our report discusses how a tighter property tax levy limit or taxpayer transparency measures similar to Utah's truth in taxation law could help reduce the rate of growth in property tax collections over time. And the report also looks at how state government could continue to offset some of these local revenue needs, but in a more structurally sound way. But property taxes aren't the only issue, as the state's income taxes pose barriers as well. The corporate and individual income tax rates are both high, both regionally and nationally, and numerous studies have shown that high income tax rates reduce state economic growth. And states with high top marginal individual income tax rates consistently suffer from outmigration, while lower tax competitors gain new residents. But in addition to rates, there are several other issues worth considering, like Nebraska's taxation of GILTI, which this committee examined last week, the heavy reliance on tangible personal property taxes, which discourage capital investment, the capital stock tax, which has become more of a nuisance tax than anything, and of course the inheritance tax, which can impact Nebraskans who inherit even relatively small amounts of property. So one of the best ways to address all these concerns is to modernize the sales tax base to additional consumer goods and services. And since the sales tax was first adopted, the sales tax base has actually eroded by nearly half. And as the base has narrowed, tax rates have had to increase in order to compensate for that lost revenue. So modernizing the sales tax base would generate both state and local revenue to offset some of these more pro-growth reforms while making the tax code more neutral in the process. And it's important to keep in mind, though, that sales tax base broadening should focus on consumer transactions, not business-to-business sales, since taxing business inputs leads to tax pyramiding, where those taxes are passed on to consumers, but in a non-transparent way in the form of higher prices. So a good comprehensive tax reform plan will indeed take time to develop and implement, but states that put in the effort are already reaping the benefits, including economic competitors like Indiana and Iowa. So in this and subsequent sessions, the unicameral has an excellent opportunity to make progress toward a simpler, more stable and transparent and neutral tax code. And I do want to commend the legislature for starting this conversation and making progress toward that end. So thank you for the chance to testify, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Any questions, Senator Pauls?
Thank you. I just have, what state would be a good one for us to take? I heard Iowa. You're suggesting we take a look and see what Iowa's done? Is that what I heard?
That's an excellent question. Iowa has made some reforms to its corporate and individual income taxes that are phasing in currently and over the next couple of years. Indiana made some great reforms over the past decade that did involve some amount of sales tax base broadening and some income tax rate reductions. And then North Carolina is one of the states that's among the most competitive. So I would say overall, the states that use the four main taxes, so both income taxes, sales taxes, and property taxes, but that have low rates and broad bases are good ones to emulate. And so North Carolina, Utah, and Indiana are the three most competitive of all the states that have the major taxes.
Okay. And since you mentioned property tax, would that fall in within one of those states you just mentioned?
Yep. So every state does use a property tax. So I'm referring to kind of the states that use what's called, some people's term, the three-legged stool. So there are some states that are most competitive on our index that avoid income taxes altogether, and that, that's great for them. They rely a lot on severance tax revenue, so that's not something maybe Nebraska doesn't have as much severance tax revenue like that, so that might not be an immediate option. But you want to look at states like North Carolina and Utah that use the major taxes.
Thank you.
Sure.
Senator Breezy.
Thank you, Vice Chair Lindstrom, and thank you for being here today and providing your testimony. I think the Tax Foundation has indicated that 47% of Nebraska's sales tax base is already business-to-business, comprised of business-to-business transactions. In the context of tax modernization, what do we do about those that are already part of the tax base?
That's an excellent question, and you're exactly right. It's estimated that about 47% of Nebraska's current sales tax collections are already paid by businesses. So taxing business inputs is already a big issue in Nebraska. Every state does that to some extent, so it's difficult to, starting from that baseline, I guess you want to just avoid making the problem worse to start.
So just look the other way and move on?
I wouldn't say that necessarily. I would say, in any sales tax base broadening, try really hard to avoid taxing business inputs.
Okay.
But it is already an issue.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Albright.
Thank you, Vice Chair Lindstrom. Thank you for being here with your information. When you look at Nebraska compared to some of these other states, because we have such a low population, how does that play into competing with others and improving our situation?
That's definitely something to consider, as I think that's a big reason why the property tax burden is so high here, since property is so spread out, and 90% of the property value in Nebraska is farmland, which is more than in any other state. So that's definitely one of the reasons taxes are high. But when it comes to tax structure, you can make the tax code better by broadening the base appropriately and trying to find a lower rate system so that it doesn't create perverse incentives. But looking at other states is fine too, like North Carolina and others that may have a larger population, but their approach is still solid.
And would you agree then that we wouldn't need so many incentives if we took care of the problems that we have? And
Absolutely.
I understand it takes a lot to get certain businesses to come, but at what cost?
Absolutely.
To those of us that live here.
Right now, as Senator Linehan's mentioned, the state has to rely so heavily on incentives because the underlying tax code is poor and complex. And so it would really make a lot of sense to try to reduce reliance on incentives as these reforms are hopefully enacted. And that will level the playing field for all businesses, no matter what industry they're in, no matter what size. Right now, only about 2 of every 1,000 Nebraska businesses can take advantage of the Imagine Nebraska program. So it's kind of missing a lot of the little guys, but tax reform, broad-based low-rate tax reform could be great for all businesses and all taxpayers.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the committee? I have a couple questions. Kind of touching on the property tax issue, and we sit in here and hear lots of hours of testimony with regards to what we spend on K through 12 education, which goes hand in hand with the property tax dilemma that we have. Our budget, give or take a couple million, about $5.1 billion. We spend around 1.1 to 1.2 billion on K through 12 education. As far as a percentage, what other states spending on K through 12 education? Specifically, when we talk about Iowa, Missouri, their property tax is a third, fourth of what we do. So I'm just curious, when we start tweaking how we fund education, what percentage of the state what would we have to pick up as a state to offset maybe some of the property tax dilemma that we're in? I mean, as you look at the other states, how does that fit into that conversation?
That's an excellent thing to look at. We at the Tax Foundation just look at the revenue side of things, so I'm not familiar with state spending on education in different states. But right now, a potential solution for Nebraska might be if the state wants to continue trying to offset some of the local property tax burden, to do that more through direct local aid paired with a tighter property tax levy limit that can reduce growth in property tax collections over time. Because right now, the state money is just going on top of the local money and no one's taxes are actually reduced. So if the state wants to help with that burden, that's fine, but there's better ways to do it that actually do what taxpayers want and reduce the overall burden.
So would you say that with the spending that's going on in the state is outpacing what we can afford as far as the percentages? Because we do have a couple bills and dealing with the 3% cap plus real growth as one component of this overall tax structure. Of course, we talk about lowering the rates on the individual and corporate, broadening the base, but there's obviously the three-legged stool. Does reducing or capping some of the spending and the speed in which government grows, would that be a component to an overall tax policy that would make sense?
The levy limit makes a lot of sense. That's the most neutral of the different types of property tax limits. It's the most effective at constraining overall growth over time. So that is a good possible solution there.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Senator Friesen.
Thank you. Vice Chairman Lindstrom. So we've talked about sales income and property taxes, but when you look at a state and you say North Carolina is extremely competitive, do you take into account all the different taxes that are out there that a business might have to put up with, occupation taxes, franchise fees, go down the long list? Do you guys look at all those too?
We look at a number of those things, including different credits and things like that, R&D credits, investment credits, as things that kind of actually cut against competitiveness because they cut against a neutral, broad-based, low-rate system. So our index uses 124 different policy variables, and so I could talk to you offline about specifically which one.
I'm just curious. Sometimes, I mean, you can have a state that might look at the taxes that everybody's watching, but if you've got other hidden fees and permitting processes that make it difficult and recoup revenue, you may have an advertised rate, but your effective rate is maybe going to be different. So.
It's definitely one of the challenges in comparing state tax codes to each other. So we do use a lot of variables, but you can't account for every single variable. So we do try to keep it to the main ones that are used in most states.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll have our next neutral testifier. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Vice Chairman Lindstrom, Senators, thank you for having me today. My name is Jim Greisch, G-R-E-I-S-C-H, and I represent Blueprint Nebraska this afternoon. For those of you who have not heard of Blueprint, it's a statewide effort involving hundreds of Nebraskans looking at the nature of Nebraska's competitiveness today and going forward to plan for an improved competitive landscape in order to grow, frankly. Grow people, grow process, grow people. We have taken a look at the pieces of the puzzle that are necessary for us to succeed, and taxes continues to come to the top of the forefront. Most of you have heard me before say, sadly, Nebraska is a very high-tax state. Many of my colleagues would say we tax almost everything that moves. And Senator Friesen, to your point, it's not just the three taxes we commonly talk about. It is a lot of taxes hidden in a lot of things. I want you to look at your cell phone bill if you haven't for a good long while, as an example. What we want to talk about today are the important things that will help us become competitive in attracting human capital. It's commonly said we have a people problem in Nebraska. We have too few. So we have to do something to increase the attractiveness to the human capital. The economic capital, Nebraska needs an economic means by which to grow our economy, and outside investment, new initiatives are important in that process. And we also have to look at the intellectual capital, commonly called the innovation capital, that will stimulate our economy going forward. You know, one of the things that's very interesting in the conversations that you've heard Catherine and others have today, state taxes matter. And whether we like to think of it in that way or not, they increasingly matter to everyone. And it's not just the one tax, it's all taxes, because what we're discovering is that while firms have had a good handle on this in the past, people are increasingly asking more penetrating questions regarding the tax burden in the places they choose to live and work. That might not have been as critical to us in the past, but if the last year has proven anything to us, it's proven that people can work from just about anywhere and be effective. And in that regard, the ability to have the necessity to create a tax policy that is attractive to workers who may not be working in the city in which their employer is located becomes increasingly important. It's not a coincidence that states like Tennessee, Florida, Nevada, and certainly Texas, but also a state to our north, South Dakota, become very popular destinations. All of them have lower tax burdens than we. It's not a secret that the mechanism by which to do that is going to require difficult choices in the processes that we tax. Now, we like to think that our tax system has worked, but the truth of the matter is it's exactly the opposite of an effective system. We have a very narrow base and high rates. It is exactly the opposite of what you've just heard Catherine suggest we need, a broad base and low rates. We must address that discrepancy. If we do not, it will be important to note that we will likely lose not only the attractiveness to future residents, but also current residents. Those who have the means to move will do so. And when they move, their revenue and taxes go with them. Now, of course, we've talked a lot about the things that we'd like to fix. Strategically, we have to reduce our property tax burden. There's no question that the optimal path to that has to be reevaluated. Let's be honest. We're looking at a system that's been in place since 1967, when our economy was largely a goods-producing economy and significantly agrarian in nature. We'll likely never leave our agriculture roots, and we shouldn't. But over time, the shift from goods to services has been pronounced here in Nebraska, and half our sales tax base has been eroded. It's important as we think about what we did in 1967 was tax the things that were important then: land, building, and equipment. Today, those are increasingly less important. We've talked a lot about the importance of simplifying our income tax system, there's ample evidence to suggest that a lower rate will be better for us in the long run. And finally, it is imperative that we change and modernize our sales tax base. If we fail to modernize the sales tax process, we will forego opportunities for revenue, important revenue growth, and we will continue to exacerbate the challenge that we have in attracting people to our state. We shouldn't be taxing 47% of business inputs. It should be less, and we have to find a mechanism to do that. Thank you for the opportunity to visit with you, and we'll look forward to your questions.
Any questions from the committee? You have a question? Senator Breezy.
Thank you, Vice Chairman Lindstrom. Thank you for your testimony here today. And we've talked several times today about business inputs, business expenses. Have you in your work so far, have you tried to define what we want to exclude in that category? Or we try to define what is a business expense or business input, or what should the definition be?
Yeah, Senator,
and if you haven't gotten there, that's fine.
It's an excellent question. So we have studied that from several perspectives. There's an academic definition of a business input. There's an economist's definition of a business input. There's an accounting definition of a business input. And then there's the business person's definition of a business input. Although they are similar, they are not identical. We have not yet modeled definitional outcomes based upon choices we might make of what's in and what's out of that definition. And until we do, I'd be hesitant to answer the question more directly.
Understand that. You bet. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question. When it comes to, as a committee over the last several years, we've looked at on the good side. It's a little easier conversation to have. When it comes to the service side, it gets a little bit more complicated. To your point, with the mobility of businesses. When you look at services such as CPAs, lawyers, financial advisors, those industries or those sectors of the economy, what are other states doing to address that as far as how they tax services? Is there an issue with taxing that? Could you maybe dive into how we address that portion of the service taxation?
I will. One caveat. So I am a former chair of the Nebraska Society of CPAs. So before I answer your question, I'd like it known that my colleagues and fellow practitioners may not like what I'm about to say. It's a mixed bag, Senator. There are states that tax that, and there are states that do not tax that. There is no right or wrong answer to taxing professional services. The majority of professional services fall into two buckets. So a tax professional services, there's a huge personal component to that. And then there are, of course, accounting services. That's a hugely business-oriented perspective. And the legal and other professional services, think investment advisory, for instance, fall in a variety of different buckets. We, again, have not studied how much of the service economy to include, although our general policy would be general hope at this point would be more is in than out. Again, some of that is going to be a business input in some definitions. So while we work to define a business input, we are also working to define what constitutes the share of the service economy that would appropriately be taxed as the final personal consumption of those services. And that's a key definition. We believe that sales tax should be levied at the final personal consumption of the service. And for that matter, the goods.
So that kind of leads me into another question with the consumption.
I knew it would.
We have another bill, I believe it's LB433, obviously a pretty big bill. I don't know if you've looked at it, Senator Erdman's consumption-based taxation bill, and he has been promoting that, and that would eliminate all income, all property, have a higher sales tax rate. Is there a happy medium in there? Do you feel that would be a good policy to strive towards? Do you have any feeling towards that? And have you even looked at it, I should say, that particular deal? Fair tax is another name, I guess, for it.
So the answer to your question is yes. Our committee has evaluated a variety of tax policy choices, including, among others, the fair tax. So making everything largely consumption-based. There's a lot of academic research out that would support the use of a consumption-based system as the basis for their preferred system. We're not quite there yet. We believe generally that the consumers should be in charge of what they decide to buy. And if they choose to buy a $5,000 TV, they ought to pay the freight on the reason for doing so. That's a personal choice. We haven't quite reached enough academic study to be able to tell you that a full consumption-based system would be an appropriate replacement. This would be a complete repeal and replacement of, the current system. What we aren't able to say yet is how much of a consumption-based system would trickle down into each of the taxing jurisdictions that fund local governmental services, including education, to provide for the appropriate revenue to service the basic functions of government constitutionally mandated by our state or any of the cities or counties or other jurisdictions across the state. That's a little beyond our purview. Okay. But we do generally agree that a consumption-based system should be a part of the solution here.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you. Next neutral testifier. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Chair Linehan, Vice Chair Lindstrom, and members of the Revenue Committee. I have included in the materials being passed around as a full written testimony, and I'll avoid that in an afternoon, the full written testimony, and summarize briefly and take any questions that you have. My name is Brian Sloan, BRYAN-SLONE, President of the Nebraska Chamber of Commerce and Industry. I'm testifying on behalf of the Nebraska Chamber, neutral as to the shell bills, but I just want to make it clear, fully in support of this committee as it seeks to modernize our tax code. It's already been noted today that our tax code is basically a 1960s vehicle which has been amended on an ad hoc basis over many decades. In so doing, it's complex, it's unadministrable in certain areas, and is no longer a viable alternative for this state if it means to continue to be competitive. On the corner of the IRS building in Washington, D.C. is a famous Supreme Court quote that says, "Taxes are the price we pay for our democracy." That may well be true. But increasingly, and certainly after the pandemic, when we're going to have a lot more remote workforce and the power of virtual business is different today than it was 2 years ago. Businesses, jobs, people are going to vote with their feet in much greater numbers after the pandemic than before. And so if we're going to remain competitive as a state, this is exactly the right time to take a look at completely modernizing our tax system to be attractive not only to businesses but to people in the state. We support this committee in this process and this discussion, and from my prior lives I know this process is not going to be very easy, and it's going to be long, it's going to be difficult, but well worth it, and something that is vitally important to the state. Within 2 years, we hope this leads to something that is game-changing for this state. Some sort of tax modernization legislation that gives us a clear path forward for a simpler, more administrable, and certainly more competitive tax code. I can't promise you that everything that this committee proposes, the Chamber will jump up and down and applaud. In fact, you'd be disappointed if we did. But what I can promise you is that every step of the way, we will support this process, and we will support this process to an end, and hopefully a good end for the state of Nebraska. And so with that, thank you for making this commitment to our children and our grandchildren, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Sloan. Any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you. Next neutral testifier. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Senators. My name is Renee Fry, Reneefry. I'm the Executive Director of Open Sky Policy Institute. I guess this is what it feels like to crash a party. So these are shell bills, a lot of X's. I just came to see what would transpire, and there are a bunch of people who have prepared testimony to talk about tax reform. Senator Linehan mentioned in her opening that she wanted this process to not be secret, to be wide open and transparent, and this feels like anything but that. I'm not sure how people are supposed to come and testify and provide input on shell bills, but there certainly seem to be a lot of people here who are doing so. I would say that this legislature did a thorough review of the tax code with the 2013 Tax Modernization Committee. They did public hearings across the state, and what I've heard today around some of the personal income tax, corporate income tax comments is in direct contradiction with the recommendations of that 2013 committee. I would also say that Nebraskans overwhelmingly oppose cutting income taxes for wealthy Nebraskans and in fact support raising them. I know you didn't hear that today because you don't have people here who represent low and middle income families. So you're hearing a very one-sided perspective on things. We have done a thorough review looking at Battelle, SRI, CREC, blueprint reports, and economic development, and what those experts recommend how we go about growing our state. Changing taxes is all but a footnote in those reports, if you take a look at those. What they recommend is investing in entrepreneurs, investing in workforce development, investing in broadband. These are the things that they suggest will actually grow our economy. I believe it's a false premise that we need to cut taxes in order to grow our economy, and you can see that in real life examples. Minnesota raised income taxes at the same time that Kansas and Wisconsin cut them. If you look at what happened during that time or following that, Minnesota's GDP grew faster, their personal income grew faster than both Wisconsin and Kansas. So I believe it's a completely false premise that we need to cut our taxes to grow our economy. It's also false that people will leave the state. We know from looking at studies of migration trends have stayed the same for years, and it's people leave to be near family, for jobs, not because of taxes. And in fact, wealthier Nebraskans or wealthier people are less mobile. So those are the comments that I wrote down and want to say. I just hope that this conversation moving forward is more transparent, that you're actually seeking input from all Nebraskans and not just the select few who were actually invited to this party. And with that, I'd be happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee? Senator Albright.
Well, thank you for your comments, but would you agree that our tax system is in need of change?
I am very open to a conversation. I think we rely too heavily on property taxes to fund K-12 education. We have been here in support of broadening our sales tax base, and those were recommendations that were made by the 2013 Tax Modernization Committee. So I think that there's still unfinished work from that committee that is worth pursuing. But again, most of what I heard today does not follow those recommendations.
But over 8 years ago is when they looked at that reform. I mean, we're looking, I believe, as a committee for some reform. And I don't think it's been a secret from the very beginnings. Chairman Linehan has let us know that it's not going to happen overnight. We're going to have to go across Nebraska and have lots of big discussions with lots of people. So I think this is just a first move in doing so, and I believe everybody will be at the party. It'll be something that has to work for all of us, and it's not that easy. If it was easy, it wouldn't be since 1967 that we've been dragging our feet in this building. So I'm hopeful that things can happen because of it.
Again, I don't know that I agree with the premise that we need to cut taxes to grow our economy. I do think there are things that still need to be adjusted. But again, these were shell bills. There was no notification to the general public that this was going to be a conversation about tax reform today. And I think that's unfortunate that this process would start out in that way.
Thank you.
Senator Pauls, you have a question?
Yes. When I was listening, I heard this, it was like 2 years from now, so in the process, I see this as a process. We're just starting it, I mean, as the committee. So I think I've always welcomed your comments, may not always agree, but it causes me to think. So as we go along, I think you ought to make sure that we are aware, because this is not going to be behind closed doors. That's my understanding. I'm at ease at taking a look, because it's one reason why I came back. Much easier for me to stay in Omaha and be on the city council than to be here. So I'm looking forward to see if we can make this a better Nebraska. And I wholeheartedly say I will listen to what you have to say, because I use you and the Platt to really cause me to bounce the ideas off.
I really appreciate that, Senator. I would say that, so it sounds like maybe you know what the timeline is for this conversation. We've heard 2 years. I have no idea.
I just heard it today.
Yeah, but there wasn't any notification. I mean, I've never seen testimony in shell bills before. My spidey sense told me I should show up and see if anything happened. But, so I'm not sure what the process is. It's very uncomfortable, and I've never seen anything like this, where there's a conversation around tax reform that begins with shell bills, and there hasn't been a process laid out. I'm not sure, how does the general public fit into that? I didn't hear any of that today. All I heard were, clearly someone had flew in for this. This was clearly planned, and very one-sided conversation to kick it off. And I worry about actually being open to listening to input from all Nebraskans when we start a process in this manner.
I'm hearing you.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions? Just so we're aware, when a bill is introduced, it is posted, it is given 7 days notice. Everybody know, you can get on the website and see that LB430, 432, and 433 are posted, and anybody can show up to testify. Whether people come in as a group and want to testify on something is completely up to these individuals. I don't think that this is a blindside on anybody. People are aware of the conversation. It's listed out in every LB. So I just want to make that clear that this isn't, we just didn't throw up the LB right here. It was 7 days notice, and anybody in Nebraska could show up for testimony on this, just so we're clear.
Yeah, no, absolutely, I agree, but it's hard to testify on a bill that has a bunch of X's in it.
I've been here a long time. We've had those bills before, and we've had a lot of people testify over the years. So, any final questions, please? Seeing none, thank you. Any other neutral testifier? Going once, twice? Senator Linehan, if you'd like to close on LB 430, 432, and 433.
Thank you all very, very much. I don't know if you, hopefully you all still have this on your desk. This is a very good document that Mr. Sloan passed out. The graph down here in the corner, like, screams the problem. Corporate income tax growth since 2009, 111%. Individual income tax growth, 37.6%. Property tax growth, 30.6%. State sales tax growth, 27.2%. Local sales tax growth, 37%. Population growth, 6.6%. So that means that 6.6% is so much lower than all those other tax growths. So we're taxing people, and they're sick of it. And I don't have a study to show you about people leaving Nebraska, but I don't have any of my college friends here anymore. Nobody that I ran around with in college lives here. And it's because of taxes. One of my children's whole organization picked up out of one area during the COVID and moved the whole thing to Texas. The whole thing. Well, we all know this. I already know you all know, so we don't need that. There are some things, hopefully, we can do this year, set the stage. And we're in a very good place. For the first time since I've been here, we actually have funding to work with, and that credit goes to this legislature, people on this committee, and the governor. We were really tight the first year we got here, $1 billion short. The next year we had money, but we had flooding, so we decided to be very wise and not spend money. And then the next year, last year, we thought, okay, we're gonna be able to do some things, and then we had a pandemic. So again, we were very wise, fiscally responsible, and did not spend money. So now, we've got 2 years of being fiscally responsible, not spending money we didn't have, and we actually have some wiggle room, significant wiggle room. So there are some bills in front of us. We've kicked some of them out already. Plan on kicking some out. I think one of the easiest ones is the parity between corporate and personal income. It hardly costs anything. It saves us money. I don't know if we took what it costs supposedly by the fiscal note compared to what we save in incentives, that there would be hardly any fiscal note. Plus, it steps us right in the right direction. We, on the school funding, I'm willing to talk, and I know several members, if not all of us on this committee, are more than willing to talk about funding public education and using more state revenues and not depending on property taxes to pay for it. We have taken them package after package saying, here's more state funding, let's move away from property taxes, and not so secret anymore, secret is, they do not want to give up property taxes. It's consistent, it's there, they don't have to worry about the economy or whether you have money to pay them or not. That's why they like them, and we need to move away from them. Let's see if I have anything else, so I don't have to do what I have to do this morning. We have another very important bill, and I need to say it every time, and everybody, hopefully we can get every senator to say, LB408. Senator Breeze's bill that we kicked out of committee and is now on the floor of the legislature. It's 3% plus real growth. Plus, if you don't use your 3%, you can bank it forward. Plus, Senator Breeze has given, with the majority of the board, the ability to take more than 3% as long as your 3-year average is 9%. It's very workable. We have an inheritance taxes in front of us. I don't know if we completely do away with inheritance tax, but the fact that we tax, this is how screwed up our inheritance taxes. So we do pretty good with low-income people. I'm sorry, I'm glad we do. If you were 65 and over and retired in Nebraska and your house is worth less than $175,000 and you make less than $47,000, we do not tax your Social Security and you do not have to pay your property taxes. But somehow if you die, your $175,000 house has to pay you have to pay inheritance tax on it to inherit it for your mom and dad. That makes no sense. Then lastly, and this is really why I feel like we're in a place that's very important and we need to take advantage of it. We have very experienced senators, 2 of them sitting right in front of me to my left, who are not going to be here 3 years from now. And we need them to get this done. And we're also lucky we have 2 very experienced senators who came back, and they've been through all these battles before, and they're brave and they're popular, so they can help us get it done. And then we have my buddies over here, who we've been here long enough to know that we need to move forward. So thank you very much for all being here today.
Thank you.
And thanks for all the testifiers.
Thank you. Any final questions? We did have no written testimony on LB 430, 432, and 433. We did have letters for the record. 1 proponent on LB 430, 1 opponent on LB 432, and 6 opponents on LB 433. And with that, that'll close the hearing on LB 430, 432, and 433.
Thank you very much.